The first hard frost came before the leaves had even finished turning. That was the first thing that made people whisper. Not because the cold frightened them, because one woman looked up at the gray sky, nodded once to herself, and quietly carried another basket of dried apples into her cabin. Everyone else laughed. They had laughed all summer. They laughed when they saw strips of venison hanging from wooden frames. They laughed when smoke drifted from her little smokehouse day and night. They laughed when every fence post around her cabin held herbs, fish, berries, and vegetables drying in the warm mountain wind. But the widow never answered. She simply kept working. If stories of forgotten frontier lives still speak to your heart, stay with this one until the end. Some lessons only reveal themselves after the snow begins to fall. Ash Hollow Valley rested high in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by thick forests and steep stone ridges that made the place feel hidden from the rest of the world. Nearly 60 families lived there. Most believed the mountains would always provide. The monthly supply wagons always came. The streams always carried fish. The hunting grounds always held deer. Life had become comfortable. Comfort often makes people forget how quickly the land can change. High above the valley stood a small cabin built against the eastern hillside. The cabin belonged to Martha Whitfield. She was 42 years old. Gray touched the edges of her brown hair. Her hands carried old scars from years of chopping wood, sewing leather, planting gardens, and lifting heavy barrels without help. She spoke little. She watched everything. Every sunrise began the same way. Before the valley stirred awake, she stepped outside carrying an empty basket. Cold dew soaked her boots as she walked through rows of herbs. She inspected every drying rack. She turned every apple slice by hand. She checked every piece of smoked fish. Nothing escaped her eyes. The work never stopped. By mid-morning, the smokehouse breathed thin blue smoke into the clear sky. By afternoon, fresh vegetables covered long wooden screens. By evening, another row of jars disappeared beneath her cabin floor. Below the cabin, the townsfolk watched her like she was some strange creature living alone on the ridge. Outside the general store, Horace Brennan leaned against a wagon wheel and pointed toward the hill. "There she goes again." Several men looked up. Martha balanced another bundle of herbs across her shoulders. She never looked toward them. Horace shook his head. "That woman is drying enough food to feed an army." Laughter rolled across the porch. Someone joked that she expected the mountains to swallow the valley whole. Another claimed she had finally let grief cloud her judgment. Only one man remained quiet. Dr. Henry Weston stood beside the hitching rail holding a leather medical bag. He watched Martha disappear among the pine trees. Then he quietly asked, "Has anyone bothered asking why she is doing it?" The laughter faded for only a moment. Nobody answered, because nobody cared enough to ask. That afternoon, Martha returned to town. She bought only salt, 20 heavy sacks. Silas Crawford stared while weighing them. "Planning to preserve every fish in Colorado?" Martha counted silver coins onto the counter. "I only buy what I know I'll need." Silas smiled politely. "You expecting a long winter?" She looked toward the northern mountains through the store window. "I expect one that people won't believe until it's already here." She lifted the first sack onto her shoulder, then another. Without another word, she walked home. Silas watched her disappear down the dusty road. For reasons he could not explain, the joke no longer felt funny. The ridge above her cabin overlooked miles of forest. From there, Martha noticed things other people missed. The swallows circled lower than usual. The squirrels filled hollow logs long before autumn. Even the wind had changed. It carried a dry bite that belonged months later in the year. She knelt beside the garden and pressed her fingers into the soil. Too cold, far too cold for midsummer mornings. Her eyes slowly closed. The same feeling settled inside her body that she had carried once before. She had ignored it years ago. She would never ignore it again. Inside her cabin, every shelf served a purpose. Bundles of sage hung beside thyme. Rows of sealed jars reflected warm sunlight. Smoked trout rested above the fireplace. Hidden beneath loose floorboards stretched a root cellar packed with potatoes, onions, carrots, beans, and carefully wrapped apples. Every space had been planned months ahead. Nothing had been stored without reason. She opened a small notebook. Each page held careful numbers. Every jar, every sack, every pound, every week until spring. She marked another line, then quietly whispered to herself, "Still not enough." As evening settled across the valley, clouds gathered beyond the northern peaks. Most people admired the beautiful colors spreading across the sky. Martha saw something else. The clouds moved against the wind. They climbed over the mountains instead of drifting away. The air suddenly turned still. Even the birds stopped singing. She stood motionless until darkness covered the ridge. Then she carried another basket into the cellar. Hours later, long after every house below had gone dark, someone knocked softly on her cabin door. Not once. 3 slow knocks. Martha reached for Samuel's old rifle. She moved without making a sound. When she opened the door only a few inches, a frightened teenage boy stood outside, barely able to remain upright. His lips had turned pale. His hands shook so badly he could not keep hold of the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Before he spoke a single word, Martha noticed something that made her heartbeat slow. The boy wasn't simply hungry. He had walked through the night. And behind him, far down the dark trail, 2 lanterns were moving steadily toward the cabin. The boy stumbled forward before Martha could ask another question. His knees struck the porch. His hands caught the edge of the doorway. His breathing came in short bursts that rattled through the quiet night. He tried to speak. Only one word escaped. "Please." Martha never lowered the rifle. Her eyes stayed fixed on the darkness behind him. The 2 lanterns below had stopped moving. Someone was standing on the trail. Watching. Waiting. The widow understood that silence better than most people understood words. She stepped outside without hurry. The cold wind brushed across her face as she listened. Nothing. No horses, no voices. Only pine trees swaying against the mountain. She looked back at the boy. His cheeks had sunk deep against his bones. His boots had almost no soles left. Fresh blood stained one sock, where frozen leather had rubbed the skin away. He had not come here to trick her. He had barely managed to stay alive long enough to reach her door. "What is your name?" The boy swallowed. "Daniel." "How old?" 16. "Who followed you?" Daniel slowly turned toward the trail. "I don't know." His words came between shallow breaths. "I heard them after I left town. They kept their distance. I thought if I reached your cabin, they might stop." Martha looked once more toward the darkness. The lanterns disappeared. Not quickly. Slowly. As though whoever carried them wanted her to know they could return whenever they wished. Only then did she lower the rifle. She grabbed Daniel beneath one arm and pulled him inside. The heavy wooden door closed behind them. The thick iron bar dropped into place. The cabin became silent again. Warm air wrapped around the boy's frozen body. Rows of dried herbs hung from the ceiling. Stacks of split firewood lined one wall. The smell of smoked trout, cedar, apples, and fresh bread filled every corner. Daniel stared in disbelief. He had never seen so much food gathered in one place, not even before the hard times began. Martha knelt beside the stove. She poured broth into a small wooden bowl. She waited until it cooled, then placed it carefully into his trembling hands. Small sips. Daniel nodded. His fingers shook so badly that broth spilled across the blanket covering his legs. Still, he obeyed. Each swallow slowly returned color to his face. Martha sat across from him without speaking. She watched the way he held the bowl. She watched the way his eyes kept drifting toward every shelf inside the cabin. Not with greed, with disbelief. When the bowl was empty, she finally asked, "When did you last eat?" Daniel lowered his eyes. "Yesterday morning." "What did you eat?" "A potato. Shared with my father." Martha remained quiet. She knew Edwin Morse. Once he had been one of the strongest blacksmiths in the valley. After his wife died, something inside him had collapsed. His forge grew cold. The bottles grew empty. His son slowly disappeared from everyone's notice. "Why leave tonight?" Daniel rubbed both hands together. "He said there wasn't enough food. He told me I was old enough to find my own." The room fell silent. Only the crackling fire answered. Martha stood. She walked to a small cupboard beside the window. Inside rested a fresh loaf of bread. She cut 2 thin slices. Not 3. Not 4. Only 2. Food measured carelessly never lasted through winter. Daniel accepted them like precious gold. He ate slowly. Every bite mattered. Afterward, Martha carried a notebook onto the table. She opened it beside the lantern. Every shelf, every sack, every jar, every pound of food had been written down. Daniel watched quietly. "You count everything?" "I count every mistake before it happens." He looked around again. "People think you're afraid." Martha shook her head. "No. They think I'm remembering." Daniel frowned. She closed the notebook. 4 winters ago, my family believed another supply wagon would arrive. It never did. They believed the snow would stop. It didn't. They believed someone would rescue them. No one came. Her voice never changed. She spoke as calmly as someone reading weather from an old calendar. The mountains don't care what people believe. Daniel looked into the fire. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the cabin walls. Far below, a lone wolf called across the valley. Before sunrise, Martha was already awake. Daniel found her carrying buckets toward the spring. Without asking, he picked up the second bucket. She noticed. She said nothing. Work revealed more than promises ever could. By noon, the boy had hauled water, stacked fresh wood, repaired 2 drying racks, and cleaned fish without complaint. His shoulders ached. His hands blistered. Still, he kept moving. Late that afternoon, Dr. Henry Weston rode up the ridge. He tied his horse outside and removed his gloves. "I saw footprints leading here." Martha nodded. "They belonged to someone who needed help." Weston looked toward Daniel. "So this is the young man everyone stopped noticing." Daniel lowered his eyes. The doctor checked his pulse, looked at the cracks across his hands, examined the frostbite on both feet. "He'll recover." Weston smiled gently. "If he keeps eating." Martha handed him a cloth bundle. Inside rested dried herbs. "You'll need these." Weston looked surprised. "You still think sickness is coming?" "I think hunger invites sickness." He slipped the herbs into his medical bag. "You've noticed the birds?" "They've already gone. The elk moved north 3 days ago. The beavers sealed their dams before the first frost." Weston slowly nodded. "I noticed." Martha looked toward the distant mountains. "The valley hasn't." The doctor followed her eyes. Dark clouds rested along the highest peaks. They had not moved since morning. "They're too early," Weston whispered. "They're exactly on time." for what is coming. As the sun disappeared, church bells echoed faintly across Ash Hollow. Judge Cornelius Blackwood had called a town meeting. Every family was expected to attend, everyone except Martha. She remained on the ridge. From her porch, she watched lanterns gathering below like tiny stars across the valley. Daniel stood beside her. "Aren't you going?" She slowly shook her head. "No. They've already decided what they believe." Daniel looked confused. "What do you mean?" Before Martha could answer, 3 sharp rifle shots echoed across the valley. Not hunting shots, warning shots. Then came shouting, then hunting, and moments later, a rider burst from the trees below, racing toward Martha's cabin with terror written across his face. "The Western Pass," he shouted, before the horse even stopped. "It's gone." The whole mountainside came down. The rider nearly fell from his horse before reaching Martha's gate. Mud covered both the man and the animal. His hands shook so badly that he dropped the reins twice before finding his voice. "The pass is gone." He pointed toward the western mountains. "Half the cliff came down. There isn't a road left." Daniel stared toward the valley below. Smoke drifted from dozens of chimneys. Children still played near the church. People were finishing supper. None of them knew their world had just changed. Martha already did. She had expected winter. She had not expected the mountain to move this soon. The rider wiped rain from his face. "The supply wagons can't get through. Not next week. Maybe not until spring." Without another word, Martha walked back inside. Daniel hurried after her. "You knew." She kept moving, opening shelves, checking barrels, writing fresh numbers into her notebook. "I hoped I was wrong." She closed the book. I wasn't. The next morning, Ash Hollow woke to panic. The general store opened before sunrise. Families crowded the porch carrying sacks, baskets, and every coin they owned. Inside, shelves emptied almost as quickly as people reached them. Flour disappeared. Beans disappeared. Coffee disappeared. Salt vanished before breakfast. Silas Crawford raised both hands. "There isn't any more." People refused to believe him. They searched behind the counter, opened storage crates, looked beneath tables. Nothing remained. Outside the store, voices grew louder. Some argued. Some begged. Others simply stood still, staring at empty hands. Across the street, Judge Cornelius Blackwood climbed onto the church steps. He waited until everyone gathered. "The road will be cleared," his calm voice carried across the square. "We have survived difficult seasons before. We must remain orderly. Share what you have. Trust that help will come." Several people nodded. Others looked toward the blocked mountains. Nobody looked convinced. High above the valley, Martha worked as if nothing had changed. Daniel split firewood until sweat covered his shirt, despite the cold air. Smoke curled steadily from the smokehouse. Fresh fish hung above slow-burning cedar wood. Every hour had purpose. Near midday, Dr. Weston arrived carrying 2 empty crates. "I've brought medicines, and I came to ask something." Martha waited. "The town council wants to know how much food you've stored." Daniel looked toward her. She answered without hesitation. "Enough." Weston sighed. "I told them you wouldn't give numbers. They're frightened. They should be." He looked around the cabin. Rows of sealed jars reflected afternoon sunlight. Every wall held supplies. Every corner spoke of months of quiet work. "You really planned for all this." "I planned for worse." The doctor remained silent. After a long moment, he spoke again. "If people become desperate, they'll come here. I know." That evening, Martha walked the edge of her property. She checked every fence post, every window, every lock. Then she carried Samuel's old rifle onto the porch. Daniel watched from the doorway. You think someone will steal? I think hunger changes people. She looked toward the valley. It already has. 3 days later, the first knock came. Not desperate, not frightened. Firm, confident. Martha opened the door. Judge Blackwood stood outside. His black coat looked untouched by dust. His boots shined despite the muddy trail. Behind him waited 2 well-fed horses. He smiled politely. Mrs. Whitfield. I thought perhaps we should speak. She stepped onto the porch without inviting him inside. We're speaking. His eyes drifted across the drying racks, the smokehouse, the stacked firewood, every careful preparation. You've done remarkable work. She said nothing. The valley needs leadership. Still, she waited. I've spoken with the council. They believe your supplies should be placed under town protection. Daniel's hands tightened around the axe handle beside the woodshed. Blackwood continued. 1 storehouse. 1 inventory. Fair distribution. It would prevent conflict. Martha looked directly into his eyes. And who decides what's fair? The council. You mean you? His smile faded. This isn't the time for stubbornness. No. It's the time for remembering. Blackwood folded his gloves carefully. If people discover how much food you've hidden, they may not react kindly. I didn't hide it. I spent months drying it while everyone watched. The judge stepped closer. You could avoid unnecessary trouble. Sign your property over temporarily. I'll protect everything. Daniel took 1 step forward. Martha lifted 1 hand without looking back. He stopped immediately. She never raised her voice. My answer is the same as it was 4 years ago. No. Blackwood studied her face for several seconds. The friendly smile disappeared completely. When he spoke again, his voice sounded colder. Winter has a way of changing minds. Martha answered quietly. So does hunger. The judge climbed onto his horse. Before riding away, he looked once more at the cabin, at the smokehouse, at every drying rack. His eyes lingered much longer than they should have. Daniel watched him disappear among the pines. I don't trust him. You shouldn't. That night, the temperature dropped again. Ice formed across the water buckets. The wind carried tiny crystals through the trees. Inside the cabin, Martha opened Samuel's old map. She marked the blocked western pass. Then she marked the northern ridges, the southern creek, every trail leading toward her cabin. Daniel frowned. What are you looking for? The easiest way to reach us. He looked up. You think they'll come? Martha folded the map slowly. They won't come while hope is still alive. She walked toward the window. Below, faint lanterns moved through the valley. People searching, trading, arguing, praying. When hope runs out, she whispered, they'll climb this hill. A sudden bark shattered the silence. Samuel's old sheepdog rushed toward the tree line, growling low. Not at a wolf, not at a bear, at a man standing between the pines. The stranger didn't move. He simply watched the cabin. Then, after realizing Martha had seen him, he quietly disappeared into the darkness. The stranger vanished into the trees as quietly as he had appeared. The branches stopped moving. The darkness swallowed him. Only the dog's low growl remained. Daniel reached for the rifle hanging beside the door. Should I follow him? Martha shook her head. No. He wants us to leave the cabin. The dog finally settled, though its ears stayed pointed toward the forest. Martha closed the shutters, dropped the heavy wooden bar across the door. Then she added another log to the fire. No one slept much that night. Outside, the wind carried loose snow across the ridge. Inside, every crack of the cabin walls sounded louder than before. Before dawn, Martha stepped onto the porch. Fresh tracks covered the snow. Not one visitor. 3. The footprints circled the cabin. They stopped beside the smokehouse, near the root cellar, behind the woodshed. Someone had spent hours studying her home. Daniel knelt beside the tracks. They were measuring. They were planning. Martha followed the prints with calm eyes. They'll come back. She brushed fresh snow over several narrow paths leading toward the cabin. Hidden beneath the white were heavy steel traps Samuel had forged years earlier. Simple, strong, silent. Then she walked to the smokehouse. She removed nearly half the preserved meat. Daniel looked surprised. Why move it? If someone burns this building, she glanced toward the hidden cellar. They won't burn everything. The next 3 days passed without another visitor. The valley below changed quickly. Smoke disappeared from many chimneys. The school closed. The church became a place where hungry families gathered instead of worshipped. Children stopped laughing in the streets. Mothers waited outside the empty store, hoping another wagon might somehow arrive. None did. The mountains remained blocked. One evening, Dr. Henry Weston climbed the ridge carrying an exhausted little girl wrapped inside his coat. She looked no older than 6. Her cheeks had lost all color. Her breathing sounded weak. "Lily Patterson," the doctor said quietly. "Her father hasn't eaten in 4 days. He asked me to bring her here." The little girl looked at Martha. "I can work." Her voice barely carried through the cold air. "I know how to sweep." Martha saw something painfully familiar. Not in the child's face, in her eyes. Years earlier, Thomas had looked at her with those same determined eyes, while pretending he wasn't hungry. Without another word, Martha stepped aside. The child walked inside. Daniel smiled gently. He placed another chair beside the fire. That night, there were 3 bowls around the table instead of 2. The food portions became smaller. No one complained. The next morning, another knock came, then another. By sunset, 4 children had arrived. Every parent carried the same look. Cracked hands, empty faces, eyes that had not rested in days. Horace Brennan stood in front of Martha with his hat pressed tightly against his chest. Months earlier, he had laughed louder than anyone. Now he could barely meet her eyes. "My boys haven't had a full meal in 3 days. His voice cracked. "I was wrong. I should have listened." Martha looked past him. The children swayed where they stood. One little boy quietly leaned against his sister because he no longer had the strength to stand alone. Only the children. Horace looked up. "What?" "The children stay here. You adults return to town." Shock spread across every face. "You'd separate families?" "I'll keep them alive. If every adult stays, too." She slowly looked toward the shelves. "None of us will reach spring." Silence settled over the ridge. One mother hugged her daughter until neither wanted to let go. Another father knelt beside his son and straightened the boy's worn scarf with shaking hands. No speeches followed, no dramatic promises, only quiet embraces. One by one, the children entered the cabin. The parents walked back down the hill without looking behind them. By the end of the week, 14 people lived inside Martha's little home. Every child received a job. Older ones gathered firewood. Younger ones sorted dried herbs. Daniel organized water. Dr. Weston visited every few days with medicines and news from town. Life became routine. Routine kept panic away. One bitter evening, Lily sat beside Martha while the others slept. She held a dried apple slice in both hands. "Why did you help me?" Martha looked into the fire. "For a long time. I thought winter had taken everything from me." She looked toward the sleeping children. It didn't. Lily quietly slipped her small hand into Martha's rough fingers. Neither of them spoke again. Outside, snow continued falling across Ash Hollow. Morning arrived beneath thick gray clouds. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 empty buckets. He stopped. Footprints. Dozens of them. Fresh. Leading toward the cabin from every direction. Not children. Not hunters. Grown men. Armed men. He slowly backed toward the door without making a sound. Martha stepped beside him. She followed the tracks with one long look. Then, she lifted Samuel's rifle. Far below, figures began climbing the ridge. Not 1, not 3. An entire line of desperate settlers moved silently through the falling snow. And at the very front, Judge Cornelius Blackwood walked with them.